Chapter 9. Well, sure, said H as they exited the stairwell. Incantations are a big part of magic, but it really depends on what spirits you're trying to invoke and what for. There are a plethora of different rituals and potions, etc. for doing magic. I know some instances where all you need is vocalization or a magic word, but that usually requires a pre-existing pact with a particular demon. You mean like you'd have to sell your soul? Asked Kenneth. Ha! H guffawed. No, nothing like that. It's more like choosing a cell phone provider than anything so dramatic. They strode past the kitchen and back out into the lobby. The receptionist turned to look as they passed into her line of sight. Her chair squeaked, and Alan's head was suddenly dominated by the question of where all this modern furniture came from. Before he could ask, however, the front door swung open, and in walked a young woman. "Laura," said H, "uncannily punctual as always." The woman yawned and plopped herself down on one of the nearby chairs, practically melting into it with apparent exhaustion. She looked to be in her early 20s, with short, auburn hair that was disheveled in a way that made it look like her skull was on fire. She wore moccasins and modest clothing that seemed high quality, albeit clearly not made by industrial technology. She must have seen Alan checking her out, because she glared at him. Without looking away, she asked H, "So these are the kiddies, huh?" "Sorry, of course," he said. "Guys, this is Laura. Laura, these are Alan, Kenneth, and Jake." She nodded dismissively. "You're younger than H made you sound," said Alan, immediately drenched in icy embarrassment. She glared at H for a moment, then suddenly burst into laughter. "It's Adam, right?" "Alan." "Whatever. Alan, you're a hoot." Alan had no idea how to process that, but it felt warm, so he smiled dumbly. "So you're what?" said Jake. "Some kind of monster hunter?" She laid a hand on the mini crossbow at her hip and smiled. "I like that description." "She's basically a mercenary," explained the receptionist. Right on, said Jake. "Kill for cash, that sort of thing?" Laura shrugged. "Usually. And that's just totally legal here." H cut in. "Jake, friend," he said. "I understand the culture shock, believe you me. Things are just different on this side. Trying to wrap a single government around such a wide variety of different species is a lot easier said than done." "Still sounds pretty messed up." "Jake," Kenneth began. Laura groaned. She turned back to H. "Can we get this over with?" "Right, of course." He dug into his pocket, removed the goggles from earlier, and tossed them into her lap. "That ought to be helpful." She tried the goggles on and looked around the room. She looked pleased at first, but grew increasingly disappointed. "Am I missing something?" "It's not quite as functional as the one Gnurgle has." "Great. So now at least I can see his insides before I kill him." She removed the device and stuffed it into her own pocket with a sigh. "It's a start." "Glad you like it." The receptionist cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me, but I contacted the Queen like you asked." Heartless turned to her. And, well, someone called back while you were downstairs. She wants to see you in person, and they said to bring the other siders." "Great," said H. "I'm honored." It was hard for Alan to tell whether or not this man was being sarcastic. When Laura spoke, it was obvious. "Who wouldn't be honored to crawl into a giant insect mound?" "That's very rude," said the vampire. Laura snickered. "Oh, you know I love the Queen." Ivenica grinned. "She must love you too, because she wants you to come as well." Laura gave the girl a strange look and nodded. "Fine. Wonderful. I can't wait." "Sounds like a road trip," said H. "Ms. Vorvalak, you're welcome to come too, of course." "Yeah," said Jake to the receptionist. "It'll be fun." "I can't." She winked at him. "Somebody has to stay and protect this place from trolls." Jake smiled, then furrowed his brow. "Wait, it's not like all trolls are bad, right?" Laura snort-laughed. "It is possible," said Alan, "considering there are different species." "Alf!" cried Kenneth. "What? I didn't say it was true, just that it's possible." "Okay," said H with a loud clap. "Laura, why don't I get you your room key? We can leave first thing tomorrow." "That sounds awesome." She stood, cracked her neck, and began walking, ahead of H, down the exam room hall toward the bedrooms. H told the rest that he would be right back and followed after her. Ivenica turned to Jake and said, "Some people say all vampires are bad." She bared her pointy teeth. Jake let out a nervous chuckle. "Is that true?" She just shrugged and smiled. The smile stayed on her face until Kenneth cleared his throat. "Why do you think the Queen wants to see us?" he asked. "Also," said Alan, "she's a goblin, right? There's a whole city underneath us filled with them." "She is the Goblin Queen," said Ivenica. "She wants to see you because you don't belong here." "Oh, thanks." "So you think she's going to help us get back home?" asked Kenneth. She nodded emphatically. "Yeah, maybe." "God, I hope so." Alan kept it to himself, but he had a sad, sinking feeling that that might be true. The following morning, Verks went out to hunt. He went into the hills in hopes of at least finding a kobold or two. Though they were technically speaking prey, nobody ever seemed to care when kobolds went missing. There were times while hunting the stupid creatures that Verks wondered whether they even cared themselves. He thought about the people of Zool, how they packed themselves into corners, crawling over each other like children in the crib. Meanwhile, their own children fed on already rotten scraps washed up in the mud. They were just as apathetic as those burrowing half-goblins. He found a slope dotted by the kobolds' unmistakable geometric burrows, but he could see through the mask that they were all abandoned. Judging by the way the ground had been disturbed, it was likely that someone else had had the same idea as him. He paused to take a piss in one of the holes before moving on. The whole of the morning was much the same. There was no wonder that he didn't see any other hunters out. It seemed the whole area around Zool had been picked clean of prey. He returned at midday with 4 birds and a clutch of eggs. Sneerin was disappointed, of course, but he got out of the house before she was able to strike. Moores was sitting on a crate outside, smoking a rolled cigarette. He offered one to Verks. It was fat and aromatic. "No zil tabaxa," said Verks, amazed. "This is tobacco." Moores shook his head. "Only 1/3. The rest you don't want to know." Verks laughed and spat in the dirt before lighting the cigarette and taking a long drag. Moores chuckled. There's a shop on the other side of town. Maybe the only good thing about this place. Verks let the buzz wash over him as he stared out into the crowded skyline, forgetting for a moment what he was looking at. "Go speak to Zuk Valsbegsi," said Moores through a cloud of his own smoke. "I saw you went outside." Verks grunted in the affirmative. "Alex Krazak Holmesel is Tolgan. No Mavakarza, go Valsbegsi Almidago go Sachuli, go Krazila Branus Tovetet, Pol Praktios Krazaetreza. Go Zibzu to go Valsbegsi Hestri." Nobody hunts around this place anymore. There's the bus that goes out every 2 or 3 days that takes hunters to a place where there's still things to hunt. I think it went out yesterday. I haven't been in a hunting party for a dozen years. I've never been. Is it any good? Verks laughed bitterly. It used to be. Moores took a long drag and smiled, letting the smoke pour out of the corner of his mouth. He said. "Why don't you come over tonight?" "I have some friends I'd like you to meet." "What sort of friends?" "Just some neighbors, people with like hearts and minds." After so many years away from his kin, Verks didn't have to think twice, but he nodded slowly over his cigarette as if he may or may not have better things to do this evening. Finally, he said, "There goes Gensuk." "Yes, I'll come." The rest of the day, he continued fruitlessly hunting for even the smallest morsel around Zool. Even the birds were sparse. He finally surrendered as the sky was growing orange, returning home with little more than a scrawny quail. Moore's shack was loud with the sounds of laughter and conversation when Verks got back. He thought about bringing his kill to the party, but thought it pitiable. In less militant times, he would have brought a fat slab of their remaining Jagzeagle, but those days were long since past. He gave the quail to Sneerin and headed straight back out the door. They were playing some sort of drinking game when he entered. The tiny, one-room shack was stuffed to the brim, maybe 10 to a dozen ghouls chanting and bouncing as a single entity, surrounding a pair of contestants standing on either side of a table in the middle. A man beside the door, whom Verks had never met before, saw him enter and immediately wrapped an arm around his shoulder, forcing him into the rhythm. "I got Volka, I got Sivet, I got Nen," they counted. 22, 23, 24, 25. One of the men at the table in the middle took a drink, pulled on a cigarette, then, as the chorus reached 30, Dogged Exy, he slugged the other hard in the jaw. The second man dropped like a sack of rocks, and the whole room erupted into cheers and wails. Verks had no idea if that had been part of the game, and the chaotic behavior of the inebriated crowd didn't clarify much. Moores emerged from the group to drag the unconscious ghoul to a cushion in the corner. He stood and shook his wings out before trotting over to pull Verks away from the man by the door. "I'm glad you came, Gnergal." He produced a bottle of pixie mead, popped the top, and slipped it into Verks' hand. Verks was glad too. Moores got to listing off name after name of these new neighbors. There was no way he would remember them all the next day, but he did his best. Either way, there was an immediate sense of camaraderie among these displaced schools, and the night was great. There was much conversation about the Beelzark in the state of Zool. The town guardians, who Verks remembered fondly from his childhood as being a class that truly upheld their title, were now violent and strict towards those they were meant to protect. Sometimes there were even raids of people's homes which were officially contraband checks, but were ultimately used to steal from and bully those who had no legal right to defend themselves. There were now curfews and steep taxes, too. There was talk of repatriation for the folks who had been corralled in here by the Goblin Horde, but that was ultimately out of any ghoul's hands. As it stood, the Queen wouldn't even allow the town to expand its borders. Special probation, she called it. And her leashed whore, the Beelzark, just bent over and let her probe. Something had to give, and it wouldn't be that pathetic excuse for a leader. Verks asked these new friends what they were doing about it. They shrugged and danced around the question, complacent as the rest of the town, it seemed. That irked him, and though it had been held back for most of the night, Verks' resolve finally brought him to his feet. He leaned in over the table and fluttered his wings pointedly. "Egos monsorgazi, toigim kiostos," he said, and marched out the door. "I will show you what we do." He returned a moment later to the room of drunken, bewildered faces, the mask strapped to his face. Moores leaned forward and regarded him curiously. "Lom kiazos ixis yarang, Verks." "What's that on your face, Verks?" Verks smiled. Of course, all that the others saw was the expressionless, bug-eyed face of the mask. He realized he must look like an actual fly. He asked, "Who's the best fighter?" Some glances bounced around the table as the group took a moment to think. Finally, the man who had knocked the other out with a single fist, Garf was his name, raised a hand. Verks invited him to attack. He had to repeat his request a bit more firmly, but the man approached. It was truly easier than Verks would have liked. Garf's drunken, silvery echoes hardly wavered at all. A tried-and-true style developed over years of scuffles, no doubt, but one which did not serve him here. A sidestep, a duck, and a swift thwack to the back of the knee, and Garf buckled. Verks kneed him in the skull, and Garf was on the ground. The rest of the room stared in awe. Verks helped Garf to a soft place and turned to them. He smiled invisibly again and said, "Otsivie." Another. That morning, as Verks was still finding nothing out in the fields around Zool, the humans at HSB were awoken by a crackling loudspeaker over each of their beds. "Good morning," came the voice of H. "Breakfast is getting cold. Everybody up." The merciless insistence of that voice reminded Kenneth of spending the night at Alan's house. Mrs. Korath crying, "Alan!" Like Jesus, why? Maybe Kenneth just hated waking up. He laid there for a few more sweet minutes as the gray light through the window grew brighter. He finally decided it was time when his legs started bouncing against the wall. He stepped out into the hall to see Laura striding out of room 13. He instinctively said, "Good morning," but she just glanced at him and passed silently toward the stairwell. He was pretty sure she actually picked up her pace. For some untouchable reason, he felt bad for her. There was a dining area across the hall from the kitchen where everybody was already sitting. Soulless was telling some story that was either a parable or an actual sequence of events. It was impossible to tell in a place like this. The man stopped and grinned a hideous, bat-toothed grin, bidding the fledgling werewolf inside. He sat down and proceeded to eat the best plate of bacon and eggs he'd ever had. After the plate was bare, he turned to say something to Jake, but he was giggling with that crazy vampire girl. Alan was being shown some arcane device by the goblin Brainless. He groaned to himself and leaned back in his chair. He caught the eye of Laura across the table, who immediately asked, "Who's having your cereal?" He frowned and took a swig of coffee. "I am 101% okay." She laughed. "You're a werewolf, right?" "Apparently. This coffee's almost better than the eggs." She nodded in a way that a simpler man might have interpreted as sympathetic. "I had to fight one once. Freaky motherfucker. He never left dog form." "Was he black and shaped wrong?" She snorted with contempt. "Yep, that's Tanner. He's actually a good boy when you're on his side." "I just as soon not be." "You really don't have much of a choice, kid. Wolves are tight, and you won't know where to stick your tail unless they teach you." She shrugged. "Sorry, dude. Welcome to the first circle of hell." That was enough melodrama for him. "Hey," he said. The masked man whipped around to face him, porcelain eyebrows raised above dark sockets. Yes, Kenneth? What's the plan? Are we walking there, or? H smiled. Of course not. The mound is 20 miles from here. 20 miles? Asked Ellen. But those tunnels I saw couldn't have been more than a mile or two away. Well, sure, the colony stretches on forever, but the Queen is way out west. Oh. So you got a car? Asked Jake. A car? Laura snickered. Heartless actually nodded. Yeah, kinda. After breakfast, necessities were packed and the party was assembled. The 4 Earthlings and 3 Brownies, who insisted at the last minute that they wanted to come, were led by H to the top floor of the building and out onto a dirt road that ran alongside the gully. H opened a garage to reveal their transport. It was a car, kinda. The main body was an old-fashioned but pristine carriage, but instead of horses, the reins were attached to a strange spherical device about the size of a beach ball. It was round and translucent, with a bunch of mechanical parts affixed to the outside like some sort of cyborg dragon egg. Inside were those glassy floating things from the laboratory downstairs. Sprites? No, something more flowery. Sylph, chirped Alan. Yes, sir, said H. He flipped a switch and the device began to hum. Inside the egg, little bolts of static struck the creatures, causing them to spin around and jitter like gyroscopic chandeliers. Their little nonsensical mutters turned into a chorus of high-pitched hoots and whistles. Jesus, are they screaming? You see, H continued nonchalantly, just as there are no fossils here on Janus, there is no coal, no diamonds, and most inconveniently, no natural gas. So B and I whipped up this alternative. One of a kind as far as I know. The sphere was slowly levitating into the air as H spoke. He climbed into the driver's seat and flipped a second switch. The sphere shook and whined louder, the sylph spun faster, and the static spread out into the air outside the crystal shell, creating a little thunderstorm underneath. Oh, don't get too close, he warned. You're torturing them, cried Jake. Of course not, H assured him. They're neither alive nor conscious, believe me, I've checked. Laura hopped into the back of the carriage and plopped herself comfortably in a corner. The Brownies followed, finding their own little spots to sit. Kenneth decided he might as well follow, then Alan, and lastly Jake. So what exactly are they? Asked Alan. Some kind of machines? In a fashion, said H. The carriage began rolling out of the garage and onto the dirt road. They're some arcane creation, magical to the core. They seem to mimic life forms in that they can copy themselves and move around. They even sing in Sophon languages, which might lead one to believe that they're conscious themselves, but as far as I can tell, they're no more intelligent than random number generators. He took his hollow eyes off the road for a second and looked pointedly at Jake. They get excited in a purely physical sense. They certainly don't feel pain. Jake seemed only half convinced, but didn't comment any further. Alan continued to press H for more factoids. He couldn't fathom that this fantastical place had no natural history. A planet only a few thousand years old, obviously. Kenneth's insane creationist uncle would have a field day with that. The next hour or so was story time. H told them all about the Ancient Ones, dragons, giants, and star people, architects of the world and all its creatures, yada yada. Kenneth lost the thread as he watched the rolling countryside. After a good 90 minutes, impossible to tell time without a phone, they finally reached the mound. It had to be 100 feet tall at the very least, a fucking mammoth anthill towering over the valley. They followed the road as it began to spiral up to the entrance at the top. Goblins were everywhere. Their tiny brownie friend, Whimsy, waved at every one of them. A few actually waved back, mostly the smaller, grungy-looking ones, presumably the same lower caste as her. But unlike Whimsy, these ones seemed fairly calm and reserved. Kenneth wondered if she was a child or maybe just a weirdo. Is this your home? Alan asked him. I mean your original colony. Whimsy shook her head, massive ears flapping. Clo. What? She is from Clo, said Wit. I am from Nuxie and Wart is from Cruxix. Cruxix, Wart affirmed. Now hang on, said H. I know that Cruxix and Nuxie were harvested some time ago, but Clo? That's the biggest colony on the East Coast. Whimsy left, Wit paused to formulate her words, of her own accord. Psst, that doesn't happen, said Laura. Whimsy leapt from her seat and started bounding around the carriage like a maniac. Jake laughed. Apparently it does. What do you mean by harvested? Asked Alan. Their queens were squashed, said Laura. The army slaughtered and the workers were captured and sold into slavery. What the fuck? Said Jake. Nothing makes a better servant than a brownie. It's in their nature. Now, that is a gross oversimplification, said H. It is absolutely true, said Wit. Oh man, you can't be that brainwashed, said Jake. My brain is perfectly clean. Jake opened his mouth as if to retort, but simply sighed and looked out at the valley below. So, said Alan after a moment, Do all goblin names start with W? Wit laughed.
No, we were named by our old ghoul.
They changed your names? She started explaining how goblins lose their names along with their homes, or something to that effect. Kenneth looked out of the window, wondering if maybe he should change his own name. To what, Fido? He remembered his mom telling him where his name came from, and that bled into little 10-year-old Jake deciding that 2 syllables was one too many. Even Stacy called him Ken. He wondered what she was doing right now. Sitting at the police station, alone and freaked out. Mom and Dad won't be home yet. They probably don't even know you're missing. Everything outside got a little blurry after that. It all became a backdrop for his chattering thoughts. He found himself spiraling down into the abyss as the carriage spiraled up into the sky. The small, rough-skinned hand appeared in front of him, snapping its fingers and waving. He found himself rocking a bit, foot bouncing loudly against the wood floor. Laura stared at him, wide-eyed, still waving. Ants do it too. When their pheromone trails get tangled, they spiral, like stupid little hurricanes.
You alive, Pooch?
Excuse me, Pooch. Get up, she barked. He realized that the wagon had stopped, and that he and she were the only ones left on board. Oh, yeah, of course. He got up and followed her out the rear onto the dirt. Did they build this place with their mouths like ants do? Here we are, said H with a grin, arms held wide to embrace the enormity of the place. Before them stood a pair of massive, well, large, massive for a little goblin, wrought iron doors set into the hillside. They were ornately carved with glyphs and highly detailed plants, animals, and goblin faces. Like a dwarven mine, said Alan quietly. H stepped forward and knocked like he was visiting his aunt's house. Actually, these doors are dwarf-made. Kenneth heard some muffled voices croaking on the other side in that funny goblin language. Finally, there were some metallic noises and the doors began to swing open. Inside was essentially what Kenneth had expected. A gaping stone tunnel curving down into the hill. Along the walls were lanterns that bathed them in an unearthly reddish light that made him feel uneasy. Between some of the lanterns were cute goblin-sized doors through which dozens of workers bounded as they passed. H was explaining some junk about goblin culture and the history of the colony, whose name he must have repeated at least 7 times by now, and Kenneth wasn't listening. He felt something brush against his neck and realized that Whimsy had climbed up onto his shoulder at some point. After what must have been 8 months of trudging down the stepless curving slope of the hallway, honestly, we must be below ground level by now. Why do we have to go up just so we could climb down again? They came upon another set of doors, these ones made from glazed wood and not nearly as decorative as the ones above. A guard stood on either side. They were bigger than their brownie friends, but smaller than Brainless, and decked out in bronze armor. The one on the right said something in Gobblish. Someone said what the language was called, and that wasn't it. And H responded in the same language. The guard nodded, said something to Wit in a casual but authoritative tone, then chuckled at the brownie's response. She nodded to her compatriot on the left, and they opened the doors. What lay on the other side was a bit more unexpected. They must have been facing the interior of the mound because the room was large, round, and vaguely conical. The walls were shiny and studded with pretty, multicolored rocks. At the tippy top hung a chandelier that filled the room with a much more comfortable yellow-white light, and directly under that stood a towering marble statue of various goblin figures piled high in some sort of flesh mountain. Rather than sad or horrific, as might have been the case if the figures were human, the expressions and body language of the stone ladies gave off a distinctly proud and triumphant sense of community, each individual lifting and exalting the next. The tiny creature on his shoulder, could be tinier, my fingers are getting numb, made a sweet little sigh in his ear as she gazed up at the statue. Her expression said it was nothing she hadn't seen before, but something she found beautiful nonetheless. There were 3 other doorways in the room, spaced unevenly enough to be annoying. H, whose plastic face held a blank, unimpressed expression, gazed round past the statue at the double doors, almost, directly opposite the group. Jake, and especially Alan, were clearly floored by this place, and that was honestly a happy sight. The other 2 goblins seemed equally impressed. Laura looked like she'd been here before. She found a spot at the base of the statue, sat down, and pulled out a knife whose edge and contours consumed her attention. It quickly became apparent that she had the right idea. One by one, the party followed suit until only Heartless remained standing, though his arms were now folded and he was leaning periodically on one leg or the other. Alan explicitly made a spot for the man by scooching closer to Laura. Heartless continued to stand, and Alan's face got a little shiny and pink. He amazingly tried to make conversation with the woman, and she amazingly didn't immediately insult him. Eventually, H sat down. About 40 seconds later, the door he had been staring at for so long finally opened. A gangly male, no taller than 4 and change, wearing sharp clothing, called for them in near-perfect, clearly rehearsed English.
Good friends, we welcome you to our colony. The beneficent Queen Leda of Amuma awaits. Please follow me.
Amuma, that's right. Leda, Amuma, Leda, Amuma. They got up, crossed the room, and followed the man through the doors, which a waiting pair of guards shut behind them. This room was long, with more of those chandeliers hanging over a great dining table lined with 24 or so beautifully carved stools. The stools had rungs between each pair of legs and extremely fluffy cushions, but no backrests, most likely to accommodate a variety of different anatomies, Kenneth guessed. The sharply dressed hob ushered them to seats near the far end of the table where the largest and fanciest stool sat empty. The males of the party were sat to the right of the throne stool, while Laura and the brownies were led to the seats on the left. One empty seat stood between each group and the end of the table. The usher departed, and they were left once again to wait. Before too long, a door at the far end opened, and a little worker tumbled out. She crawled about and among them, seeming to sniff out the room with her antennae, focusing particularly on the bodies of the visitors. Uncomfortable, but understandable. Finally, she ran back through the door and returned a moment later with the queen in tow. The woman was simultaneously more humanoid and more insectoid than any of the goblins they'd met thus far. She stood at a good 5'8", with magnificent translucent wings that spread wide as she entered the room. She's lady spreading. Judging by the size of them, Kenneth had no doubt that she could actually fly. The wings fluttered and tucked themselves away as she glided to the throne stool, long embroidered robes swaying just millimeters above the marble floor. She sat down and regarded her guests with a smooth-skinned, angular face, slender antennae waving as if savoring the air. As her great black eyes landed on Kenneth, he felt a wonderful shiver run up his spine and had to look away. Seemingly satisfied with her assessment of these visitors, her arms emerged from under the robes. There were 4 of them, entirely unsurprising. But they were not like true full arms. It was as if each had been split in 2, the lower pair taking the pinky and ring finger, leaving the upper pair with the useful digits. She clasped both pairs over the table before her and smiled. "Welcome," she said. H nodded respectfully. "Queen Leda?" Laura also nodded, but said nothing. Kenneth imitated the display. He had to hold in a laugh as he saw that the 3 brownies had their foreheads pressed hard against the table. The comedy of this unusual cultural practice dried up quickly, as the girls were clearly waiting for permission to rise. Kenneth glanced at the queen, who turned to Heartless. "Mr. Moreau," she said, "won't you introduce us to your companions in Dugil?" At the sound of the unpronounceable goblin word, H's non-existent eyebrows practically leapt off his face. "Ladies," he said. The brownies shot straight up, with almost imperceptible sighs of relief. Before there was time to decipher this interaction, the queen began to speak. "Here we find ourselves in a situation which we deem to be most undesirable," she said. H sat stoic, but the smirk on Laura's face made it clear that Leda was furious at the masked inventor. "I share your concerns," he said, mask stone solid. "Of course, I take full responsibility for both the loss and retrieval of the Mask of Sight." "No, Mr. Moreau, let us all take this one step at a time." She spread her right hands out to indicate the Earthling boys. "A trio of natives stranded on our side." "Oh, we wanted to talk about that," said Ellen. "Going home, I mean." Kenneth cringed, fully expecting this imposing woman to rip Alan's own arm in half for interrupting. Instead, a deeply sad smile spread across her face. "We will discuss that too, in time." Laura caught Alan's attention and shook her head slowly. Leda looked back to H. "A trio of native children stranded here. A double homicide on the other side," she continued. "A terrific breach of security." "To be fair," said Jake boldly, "that was all the ghoul, wasn't it?" She ignored him. "Your trial will be held early this evening." H bowed. "Of course." She addressed the boys. "For now, we recommend you all take some lessons from Miss Carver." Laura grimaced. "Lessons? On what it means to be an immigrant to our world." Laura pursed her lips. "H is from Earth, too." "Indeed," said the Queen. "But for the time being, Mr. Moreau is under arrest."